So, will the Iran protests spread to China? Read an article last week about the impact of the Iran protests. So, just Iran has been engulfed by some pretty big protests. The biggest protests they had some notable ones 2009, 2017, some fuel type protests with the cost of gas in 2019, and some more like feminist type protests in 2022, spreading into 2023. Um, but it was very interesting seeing how this impacts other countries and if this could spread this sort of like anger, specifically with China. So, China, much bigger economy than Iran, but similar sort of authoritarian states. So the question becomes, can it spread to China? And the article kind of mentioned China viewing this from like a very risk management framework, right? As if it could be risky. Now, does this mean that it could spread and create this huge chaos in China and lead to the downfall of the Chinese regime? So, kind of what's happening in Iran right now is people want to create something called the Republic of Iran. Some people might call it the Republic of Persia, but like down with the current administration. Could something like that happen to China? So let's talk about it. I don't think so. I don't think it could. But it is very interesting because it's part of a broader trend that we've been seeing. And there are other countries, not China particularly, but other countries that should be concerned. Or maybe not concerned. Depends if you're in the government or part of the people. But it is very fascinating. So just a couple points that I jotted down that I want to talk through. Um, you got to look at the context of it all, first of all. Seeing how China, two big sources of oil that they have. Well, there's three, there's a lot, right? But like, let's talk about three of them. Venezuela, well, that's been affected because of the actions of the Trump administration in Venezuela. But more than that, I mean, like they were still selling oil to China, but there's been a blockade. So the US military, they started kind of a blockade of oil going out of Venezuela to other countries, notably China. So they're kind of hurting in that aspect. What's another big source of it? Russia. Well, Russia's going to keep going. And in fact, China buying Russian oil is the whole reason Russia's kind of like still relevant and still able to pursue the war in Ukraine. But the third one, the third important one being Iran. So they get so much oil from Iran. So if there was a change, and let's say this new regime, so let's say the protests continue, right? They're kind of died down right now, but let's say they continue. You can see China's kind of risk and kind of fear at this. And also the big fear domestically for China, seeing what if these protests continue, right? What if they spread? What if people in China start seeing it? Now, one thing that's very interesting is that there is sort of like, so one of the big stories last week was how Iran, kind of the government, put this huge internet blackout over the whole country. And so no one could share information, and it's very hard to mobilize. Like, think here, I live in the US, I live in Ohio. Think of in the US, like you want to organize. How do you find out where a protest even is? Well, you go online, you see where the protest is. They couldn't do that. And they cannot do it in China either, right? China's very infamous with the firewall, the Great Firewall of China. And so they do the same. And there were reports actually of the same surveillance technology that China uses being used in Iran. The protests allow. So let's go to like current state of how it sort of is, because people have died in this protest, and there is fear that it was reminiscent of like an Arab Spring type situation. But now it seems like the regime has controlled the protest. There is, you know, can this spread, for example, to something like Latin America? Probably not, right? Because it's pretty far. But the broader trend that's super interesting is the sort of thing that's called like the Gen Z protest. So they're basically younger people, people of my generation, who they're unsatisfied. So a very key figure to see is you got to look at the youth unemployment rate. So countries with high youth unemployment rate, which Iran, by the way, is. Let me just look at something to make sure I get the right information. Um, like Iran's not even like the highest one, and they're still dealing with, um, you know, these protests. But you look at countries with high unemployment rate, like youth unemployment rate, so that being, I don't know, 16 to 25-year-olds, they've been experiencing some unrest. So let me just list a couple that come to mind that happened last season, right, in the fall of 2025. So Madagascar, that's probably the biggest one, right? Like huge protests in Madagascar, change of government. Protests in Morocco did not change the government, but there were pretty significant protests in Rabat and Casablanca. We saw protests in Bulgaria. So it's different continents. Nepal is another one. And you can kind of start seeing a trend there. Now, Iran's not like top 10 youth unemployment, and neither is China. And in fact, the reason I don't think this is going to threat to China, so because when I read that news, and it's easy to kind of see those news, and that's kind of why I want to start this, to be able to share these things from an objective point of view, but be able to share these things with people so that they react and say, no, it's probably not going to spread to China, right? Because China has had many of these protests before, right? And I also want to like reiterate, these are huge protests, right? And not a lot of information has been able to get out of Iran. But basically, they have like neighborhood watch of the Basij group, I think it's pronounced, but it's basically this like paramilitary group that enforces the law for the current Persian regime. 3,000 people have died. Like, it's significant protests, right? More than 25,000 people have been arrested for civil disturbance. So this was big, and you can see kind of how this can definitely like strike fear in China, and how people might see like, oh, like, is this gonna spread to China? There was definitely like, there have been protests before in China, right? I think 2017 there was the Hong Kong protest. There were protests in, I believe it was 2022, around COVID. So China was very strict with their COVID policy. Makes sense. And to a large part, they, given the circumstances, not that it spread from China to the rest of the world, but they did, given their population, a relatively good job controlling it. But they kind of, some people might argue, it went too far. And so there were big protests on that. There were like the blank paper protest. At my school at Ohio State, a lot of Chinese international students, I would see them protesting, and like, it spread everywhere, and it was big, and China still suppressed it like that, right? And the same thing happened in Iran. It's easy to get excited with these protests, but it's very hard for them to lead to change in countries that have more, I don't want to say, they're not developed democracies, but they're more established governments, right? Bigger economies. It's easy to, let's say, topple the government of Madagascar. But Iran, and definitely China, it's much, much harder. Like, Iran could fall. Like, it could fall. But China, I mean, that's way harder. Now, that's not to say it doesn't merit our attention, right? Because you can see how this starts to devolve, and the dominoes start. Well, that's one of the biggest things about foreign policy, that the dominoes kind of start falling. And so, let's say there is regime change in Iran. Let's say the US gets involved, and all of a sudden that Persian oil is not going to China. Well, that kind of affects China. So like that kind of puts more, I don't know, things in play. Maybe that leads to stronger cooperation with Russia. Maybe it leads to more support for Russia in the war of Ukraine. Like, you can see, there's other countries that I think should be in watch of like this like Gen Z fever. Because if you look at the people that were protesting in Iran, it was young people. So you can look easily at countries that had monarchies that now do not have monarchies, kind of like Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan. Like, those three countries, you could see something similar if the economy starts. I think a lot of African countries, right? Like, we've seen stuff recently in Guinea, Gabon, but you could see something like that, like, I don't know, Algeria. Algeria came very close in 2019. South Africa. In Europe, maybe like Albania, Serbia. So you can start seeing how like this broader, I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. Could even reach like a place like Cambodia, Indonesia, big countries. But could it spread to China? No, because the other thing I wanted to point out is like, things are, and I think it's easy in the US to kind of like understand, like, you know, China's so different. They are very different. It's a different system of government, but their economy is a juggernaut. Okay, it's the G2. It's like the US and China. And if you look at so much stuff that goes on in our world, it's always either the US or China behind it or because of them, right? Like even Trump right now with Greenland is trying to justify taking Greenland because China wants it. Whether they actually want it, that's to be determined and maybe not true. But it's all because of kind of like the other. And China, like their economy's not terrible. They're actually not terrible at all. Now, they have some concerning things, right? Like there's this article from the Wall Street Journal about China's economy kind of deteriorating on some fronts. Their demographics are not great. So they had the one child policy from the 1980s until 2016 or something. That was kind of like not the best policy because now their population is kind of a mess, right? Like there's an imbalance gender wise, future population wise. Like they're probably going to need a lot of immigrants from, I don't know, Southeast Asia, maybe Africa, like in order to keep up with their massive, massive economy. But if you look at the data, because it's always important to look at the data for unemployment rates, so youth unemployment rates as like a parallel, right? Not like a close, this equals the other, but like a parallel of, or like a sign of potential domestic instability coming. You look at China and like it's 17%. It's not bad, right? Like it was 21% in 2023, which is around where you saw like the bit like the white paper protest. In the US, it's like 10%. And by the way, in the US, like the average unemployment rate is like 4%, I think, for the whole population. Youth unemployment rate, and like we feel it living in the US, like young people, harder to get jobs than it was 2 years ago. Iran, it was 22%. So that's what, like, I think once it starts crossing 20%, you start seeing it more. And in places like Morocco, it was much more than that. And that's kind of why you saw those protests. So, yeah, those are kind of the main things that I wanted to see. You are seeing kind of like, it's very interesting to me. See, so there's this saying that when the US catches a cold, the rest of the world gets like a massive flu or just a bigger sickness, if you will. So when there's a change in the economy that we felt since like 2014, right? And in the US, in the West, it manifests in elections. So it manifested in electing people who promise radical change. So whether it's 2016 with Donald Trump in the US or Viktor Orban in Hungary, Marine Le Pen in France, and like traction she's gaining in Latin America, it looks like Bukele in El Salvador, Milei in Argentina. But in other countries, again, like that's the cold version of it, the big sickness, the flu version of it, like the bigger impact felt in the rest of the world. Because just think about it, like if in the US, we feel some of the economic effects of like this changing global order, you feel it, that it's kind of, the economy is not perfect. It's not a guarantee you'll get a job. Imagine how it is in a place like Madagascar. So that's when you start seeing kind of like these like very, very intense protests. And if the US, like, not the US, if China, like, if eventually the carts are right that like oil gets super high or something that just like the Chinese public cannot tolerate any longer, do not expect them to go down without a fight. So I predict that we got to get used to this, China. That if you're someone who's like investing or something, like, do not expect like, oh, easily like there's big protests in Iran, they're gonna spread to China. No, I don't think so. Now it's worth taking a look at it, but you can see at the stuff they're doing in Xinjiang, I think it's pronounced, like their Western Turkey province. They're very easy. Like those people do not like China, and they haven't gotten anywhere with their, and the unemployment rate is much bigger than other parts of China in the east, and they haven't gotten anywhere. And so, yeah, but I think it's an interesting kind of situation. And again, as I said, if maybe not China, but there's other countries that you should definitely keep an eye off, right? Keep an eye out for, I would say Egypt, for example, is a big one. Iraq, we haven't talked about Iraq for a while, but Iraq could definitely, like, you kind of saw the stuff that happened with Syria, that we haven't talked about them since 2015. All of a sudden there's a big change and the government falls. You could see something like that with Iraq, maybe Afghanistan. So there's definitely change coming, and it's a much more dynamic world than it was even a year ago. So I guess the final thing I would say is trying to, just giving a try out on this. But the whole idea is that it's a way that's easily explained. There's so much stuff out there. Um, so just trying to explain it in a simple manner that's easy to understand. Very passionate about this stuff. I think it's super, super interesting because it's all connected. And so we'll see, but definitely wanted to just share my thoughts on that. And yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.